Chapter 28. All Misty wanted was to stay wrapped in Tate's arms until this was all over. Instead, she took his hand and led him to the couch. "Sorry it took me so long." They settled on the sofa. "Detective Reyes wanted to talk to me before I came up." "About?" Hughes came from behind the couch. "Ms. Lake, can we talk for a second?" The apartment was filled with bodies. Police officers, lab techs, bodyguards, and now Reyes was back too. "Sure." His eyes flicked to Tate. "Privately, if you don't mind." Leaving the comfort of Tate's side, she followed Hughes out the apartment door onto the landing. She figured the people in the other units were cursing her and all the commotion in the middle of the night. Hughes walked to the end of the hallway and turned. "How well do you know Steele?" The question startled her. "I've known him for years. We went to law school together." "So you trust him?" "Should I not? Did anyone else know where you were staying?" Besides Summer, only Tate knew. And Reyes. But she figured the detective didn't count. "It's possible he let your location slip," Hughes said. "Reyes thinks somebody followed him here." "I'm not convinced. You and he are getting closer. I got the impression you weren't particularly close last weekend." "True?" "Yes, but—" "You sure he's not playing you?" She was. Of course she was. Wasn't she? "I'm not convinced he can be trusted. Are you?" His dark eyes held a challenge, daring her not to take his question seriously. Tate had done nothing but help her all week. He'd worked with her on the cases. He'd gone with her to see the IAF property. He'd even gone to visit Freddie Parks's mother. Surely he wasn't working against her. "Is it possible," Hughes asked, "that Tate has been sticking so close because he wants to know what you're up to?" "No. Right? I don't think so. I mean, it was Leland who assigned him to help me. Leland's idea." "You're sure?" When Leland had asked Tate to help, he'd seemed surprised. But that could have been an act. Maybe he'd offered to help, and Leland had taken him up on that offer. Maybe he'd insinuated himself in her cases for a reason. But if that was true, then none of it was real. Not the kisses, not the affection he'd claimed. But he was here. She'd called him in the middle of the night, and he'd rushed over. He could have not answered his phone, pretended it hadn't rung, or he'd had it on silent, or it had died. Not that his being here was proof of anything. If he was trying to fool her into thinking he cared, and keep tabs on her, what better way than to show up in the middle of the night? What would Tate have to gain by spying on her? Did she really think he was working against her? If so, then he was working with her enemies. Who? Griffin? Tate wouldn't be involved with a guy like that, or Parks and Dawson and whatever was going on there. A man had been murdered this week, and she could have been as well. Did she really suspect Tate of colluding with murderers? No. Everything in her told her Tate was trustworthy. "I trust him," she said. Hughes's lips slipped into a smirk. "That's your prerogative. I don't. I'm not comfortable leaving you alone with him." "Good thing for me, you don't get to decide who I spend time with. I recommend you rethink your opinion, or at least entertain the notion that I might be right. He's an assistant district attorney. He works against criminals, not with them. If he were working with Griffin or Parks or Dawson, that would make his entire life a lie. No, that's not who he is." "If you say so." Hughes nodded toward the door, and she spun and marched back in. She refused to let herself doubt Tate. He was the only friend she had in this mess, and she wasn't going to let Hughes's paranoia, or anybody's, take that away from her. Misty was seated on the couch beside Tate, holding his hand. She'd spent 20 minutes talking Summer out of rushing to the city to be with her. Hughes and the rest of the guys were bad enough. The last thing Misty needed was her big sister hovering, telling her where she could go and what she could do. It'd be like childhood all over again. After she'd finally ended the call with Summer, Misty snuggled up beside Tate on the couch, where they waited while police and lab techs moved around the apartment as if they belonged. She wished she could say she'd put that conversation behind her, but Hughes's words echoed in her mind. Of course Tate could be trusted. Hughes didn't even know him, so it made sense he'd be suspicious. If nothing else good came out of this week, being isolated from work convinced her she needed to quit trying to live her life alone. Summer had been saying as much to her for a month. Her recent scare with Ramon had convinced her she needed people in her life, so much so that she'd picked up everything and moved to New Hampshire. Crystal, their oldest sister, had been saying the same thing for years, to both Summer and Misty, that they needed friends, community, and each other. Misty understood now what she'd been missing. If not for Tate's frequent visits, she couldn't imagine how isolated she'd feel. He'd been kind to her. Not only that, but he felt something for her. He liked her, and she liked him. She refused to let Hugh's paranoia destroy their budding relationship. But what if it's not real? What if he's lying about everything? She shook her head to rid it of the unwelcome thoughts and focused on the activity around her. Almost an hour had passed since Tate's arrival. A lab tech had dusted the doorknob for fingerprints and then moved out of her line of sight. Reyes had stepped out a few minutes before. Now she returned, said something to one of the cops, and then circled the chair nearest Misty to sit. Finally, "How you doing? I'd like to know what's going on." There were two men. Your second bodyguard was in a car down the street, watching the door. We understand from Mr. Hughes that sometimes the second guard stands on the stoop, so maybe the intruders thought he wasn't there. One of them crouched to pick the lock and— She consulted her notes. Mr. O'Brien. Ian? Misty guessed. Right. He notified his partner, called the police, and then crept up and engaged them in a fight. While he was fighting one of them, the other one got inside the building. I heard a gunshot. The guy O'Brien was fighting discharged his weapon, but it missed its mark. Who were they? Tate asked. We're still working on that. They've been taken to the station, where they'll be questioned. Nobody got shot, though, right? The last thing Misty wanted was for someone to be harmed, and Ian had already taken a bullet once that week. Nobody got shot, Reyes confirmed. While O'Brien and the first intruder were fighting, the second intruder came in the building. He got to your apartment and kicked the door in. Misty glanced that way. Someone from Summer's agency was crouched beside it, repairing the damage. Reyes continued. We think he searched pretty quickly, based on the timeline. Then he went up to the roof, where Mr. Hughes took him down. I helped. The words came from behind Misty, and she turned to see Ian standing there, beaming. On the opposite wall near the door, Hughes scowled. Reyes glanced at the younger bodyguard. Mr. O'Brien cuffed the guy outside to the railing and joined the fight on the roof. And then we showed up, late to the party. I think you know the rest. Any idea how they found me? Reyes's gaze flicked to Tate. It's possible somebody followed Mr. Steele when he came to see you. I've been thinking about that. Tate sat up straighter beside Misty. If that's true, they'd know the building, but how would they know which apartment? By the lack of surprise in Reyes's expression, she'd considered that already. Miss Lake, your sister owns this unit? She bought it a couple of years ago. So somebody could have looked up real estate records and found that your sister lived in the building. That would tell him which apartment was hers. Tate settled against the cushions again. By the rounded shoulders and downturned lips, he was blaming himself. Misty squeezed his hand. It wasn't your fault. This is what we get for trusting our coworkers, he said. What do you mean? Who else would have known you and I were working together? Tate asked. Oh. That made sense. Unless you told somebody? Reyes directed the question to Misty. Only people at the office. I had one of the interns look up a few files and print them to give to Tate, so she could have guessed. I'll need names, Reyes said. When you get a minute, you two think about everybody who might have known or guessed you were working together. For the next few minutes, Misty and Tate compiled the list. By the time the police gathered their things to leave, Misty was able to give it to Reyes. Thanks for this. We've already started looking into your coworkers. We'll be able to cross-reference this with the ones already on our radar. It was a chilling thought that somebody at the DA's office might be working with criminals. She and Tate waited until finally, everybody headed for the door. The bodyguard who'd replaced Hughes, Smitty, she thought that was his name, closed the door after them but stayed inside. He stood with his back to the repaired door, as if he intended to stand right there all night. "You can go into the hall. Hughes asked me to remain in here as long as you're not alone." This guard was shorter than Misty by an inch or two, and thinner than many of the guards she'd seen, but he seemed strong enough and confident in his role. "Tell Hughes I appreciate his concern, but I'll be fine." The man squinted. She didn't miss the way his eyes flicked to Tate. Beside her, Tate tensed. This was ridiculous, considering she'd been alone with him countless times prior to tonight. "Step outside, please," she said. "You let me know if you need me." Smitty glared at Tate for a long moment. "I have a key. I can be inside in a second." She waited until he stepped into the hall and closed the door, then exhaled and collapsed against the sofa cushions. She rolled her head to face Tate. "Sorry about that." "I don't blame them for suspecting me. I can't believe I was so careless." "We don't know what happened. Let's not jump to conclusions." Rhea seemed pretty confident. She smiled. "My cousin John always says it's important to be confident, especially when you have no idea what you're doing." That made Tate grin. "You need anything?" she asked. "I'm fine." She settled against him, allowing herself to relax for the first time since Hughes had woken her. She yawned. "You don't have to stay. I'll be fine by myself." Tate shifted away. "Do you want me to go? Are you mad at me for leading them here?" "It wasn't your fault." She angled to face him. "I don't want you to go, but I understand if you want to." "I don't think I can leave you alone tonight. If it's okay, I'll just stay here on the couch." "It's okay." She snuggled beside him, thankful for his warmth and the comforting arm wrapped around her. "You must have been so scared." She nodded against his shoulder. "Especially so soon after what happened this summer. I can't imagine." "It's funny, though. I wasn't thinking about the kidnapping. Maybe because I was hiding, and sure I'd be found. The thing Hughes had me hiding behind was too small, but I guess he figured the darkness would cover me. Anyway, it reminded me of being a kid, when my dad was on a tear. I used to hide behind my sister as if she could protect me. But she was little too, you know? She couldn't shield me from everything." "Let's get comfortable." Tate shifted, stretching his long legs out on the couch. She followed suit, settling her back against his chest. He pulled a blanket up to cover them. "So, you were thinking about your father?" Should she tell him more about her life and her family? It wasn't exactly a happy story, but if there was going to be anything between them, she wanted him to know her, the real her, even the ugliest parts of her past. And the memories were so close, they felt like a presence in the room. Suspicion was still buzzing like a fly inside her, but she needed to silence it. She could trust Tate. She could, right? She closed her eyes, breathed in his presence, but focused on the Lord. Should I trust him? There was no answer. There was also no anxiety or fear. Maybe she was crazy or tired or stupid. Or maybe Tate really could be trusted. She decided to believe in him. Summer always tried to protect me. But there was this one time when she went to a friend's house after school. Her friend's parents were supposed to bring her home before dinner. She was always careful to be there before Dad got home from work, just in case. But I think their car broke down or something, so she was late. Crystal wasn't home either. It was just me and Mom and Dad. He got home early from work that day and started drinking. She'd always thought it apropos when people called liquor spirits. When Dad drank them, he became possessed. By dinner time, he was raging. Misty could picture the scene so easily. Their kitchen was decorated in pale yellow and bright red, but the cheerful decor had no effect. The room was a place of fear. The whole house was. Mom had fried haddock, and the scent of it hung heavily in the air. Misty'd never been a fan of fish, and that night her stomach was roiling with fear and nervousness. She kept her head down and picked at the meal. Dad was on his second helping when he caught sight of her plate. "Finish your dinner." His shout had startled her, causing her to drop her fork. It clattered to the floor. "Pick that up! What is wrong with you?" "Sorry, Daddy." She'd scrambled down to grab it, then tossed it in the sink before pulling another from the drawer and returning to her seat. What are you doing? He barked. Clean the floor. You can't just leave fish guts there. Mom pushed back from her seat. I'll take care. Let her do it. Spoiled little brat thinks she can do whatever she pleases. Fighting tears, Misty grabbed a sponge from the sink and crouched to wipe the floor, making sure to clean all around where the utensil had hit, just in case. Back in her chair and holding her breath to keep from smelling the fish, she shoveled the gross stuff into her mouth. Is that how we eat? What are you, a dog? Slow down. Daddy hadn't always been nice to her, but he'd never been so mean. She'd heard him talk like that to Crystal in summer, even to Mommy sometimes. But she'd thought he liked her. She'd thought she was special. She started crying, but kept her head low so Daddy wouldn't see. She was careful to eat more slowly, trying not to gag. Finally, she finished and gulped her water. Well, get up and clear the table, Dad barked. Yes, sir. She took her plate and Mom's to the counter, then returned to get Dad's. She reached for it, but he grabbed her arm and gripped hard. It hurt, but she didn't say anything. She didn't move or even try to get away. She thought about the neighbor's scary dog, how, if you didn't look it straight in the face, it would leave you alone. So she kept her eyes on her feet and her mouth clamped shut. What do you think you're doing? Clearing the table, like he'd asked. But she didn't say that. That was the wrong answer. Answer me! Before she could form words, he stood, lifted her, and flung her across the room. She whacked into the wall, banging her head. Stupid girl! Mom ran to help. She bent close and whispered, Go to your room and don't come out. Misty didn't need to be told twice. She ran, trying not to hear the shouting and fighting behind her. Somehow, the words, the memories, spilled out of her mouth now. Even though years had passed, tears dripped down her cheeks. Tate didn't say anything for a long time. When he did, his voice was low. How old were you? 7. He sucked in air through his teeth, tightening his arms around her. She was facing away from him, so she couldn't see his face, but she heard, or maybe felt, a growl low in his throat. Your dad still like that? He quit drinking. With Mom gone and us not living there, he doesn't have anybody to take his anger out on anymore. And I think he's softened a little over the years. After Summer and I were kidnapped, he asked us to come home. He wanted to take care of us. We could tell he was trying to make us feel safe there. But how could he, after everything he'd done? Did he really think a month of good behavior would make up for an entire childhood of abuse? We left as soon as we could. And now Dad's alone. I think he'd like us to come around more, but he's dealing with the consequences of his choices. Serves him right. Tate kissed the top of her head. That's not very charitable of me, but I sort of want to kill him for what he did to you, and your sisters. She didn't mind knowing Tate would stand up for her, that he wanted to protect her. I can't imagine such a horrible childhood. It wasn't always horrible. I got the best of it, honestly. Summer protected me most of the time. And Crystal, looking back, I realized she allowed herself to take the brunt of Dad's anger. She never fought back like Summer. I think she was trying to keep him away from us. Her sisters had tried so hard to protect her. It was one of the reasons she tried to protect others by putting bad guys away. It felt like the least she could do. When my parents fought, we'd all pile onto Crystal's bed, and she'd read us The Boxcar Children. We had the whole set, but I always liked the first one the best. I don't know that book. 4 orphan siblings run away and make a home for themselves in an abandoned boxcar. I remember dreaming of running away. I thought we could have a happy home, my sisters and I. That was always my dream. She chuckled, almost didn't want to admit the rest. But she wanted Tate to know her, even the weird things. To this day, when I feel sad or lonely, I pull out my copy and read it. Silly, huh? Not silly, sweet, innocent. And isn't that what you've done? You've created a life for yourself, a home. Yeah, I guess. But it's not what I imagined. What was beautiful about the story was the way the siblings worked together. It wasn't just that they were safe. They were a family. He held her a little closer. You're not alone, Misty. Because he was there. Gratitude bubbled up inside her, threatened to escape in the tears stinging her eyes. She settled in, thankful for the arms holding her, the man who'd rushed over in the middle of the night to be with her. "Can I ask you a question?" Tate's voice was tentative in the quiet. "I guess." "Why did tonight remind you of your father?" "Oh." She considered her answer, wondering about it herself. "I think maybe the helplessness and hopelessness of the situation, knowing there was absolutely nothing I could do to protect myself. If Hughes and Ian had lost the battle and the bad guys had won, whatever their goal was, to hurt me or take me or kill me, they'd have done it. I was utterly defenseless. I didn't even have on shoes." Her voice broke in a laugh, or maybe a sob. "And maybe that too. Being in my pajamas, being pulled from my bed, all of it reminded me of my childhood, listening to my parents fight through the door." "Helpless," Tate said, "and hopeless. Those are two of the worst feelings in the world. But, as a child of God, you're never either one of those. You know that, right?" "I was praying God would help, and he did. Even if he hadn't intervened, he would have been with you. Ultimately, your help comes from him, and your hope is in him. It's hard to feel that in the moment. There's a difference between what we feel and what we know is true." She'd been fighting the battle of her feelings for years, so she knew Tate was right. He traced circles on her shoulder with his fingertips, the feeling comforting and relaxing. She yawned, and he did too, then chuckled. "You can sleep, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." It should feel strange to sleep in Tate's arms, but it didn't. There was nothing inappropriate about their position, or her feelings, or his behavior. He was simply making her feel safe and protected. She let her eyes drift shut. Maybe she'd just rest for a few minutes. She really ought to get up and go to bed, and let him go home. But she feared being alone, dealing with the memories of all that had happened that night, and in her past. So she closed her eyes and let go of it all, reveling in the safety of Tate's arms. Misty hurried to the door around 9 the next morning to press the intercom. "Yes?" "I'm back." She buzzed Tate in, tamping down her eagerness to see him. It was silly, really, considering he'd only been gone an hour. They'd slept all night on the couch, cuddled up together. She'd never spent an entire night with a man. She'd never trusted any man enough to be that vulnerable with him. But Tate made her feel safe. Not once from the time he'd walked in until he'd kissed her goodbye that morning, a quick peck on her cheek, had he given her the impression he wanted anything from her. All night in his arms, and his hands had never strayed anywhere they shouldn't. There was something incredibly attractive about a man who wasn't all about a physical relationship, and his early morning look hadn't hurt. Crumpled clothes, messy hair, unshaven cheeks. For a moment, she'd allowed herself to imagine waking up beside him every morning for the rest of her life. Now she pulled her door open and stood aside for Tate to enter. Rather than taking the time while he was gone to shower, she'd slipped into yoga pants and a t-shirt and used the solitude to read her Bible and pray. Despite the crazy events of the night before, she felt calm. Knowing how she'd reacted to being kidnapped both times, she could only attribute her peacefulness to God. Tate sniffed, his eyebrows lifting. "Do I smell bacon? I promised you breakfast, didn't I?" He headed into the kitchen, where she'd pulled bacon out of the oven to cool a few minutes earlier. "Eggs or pancakes?" she asked. "I should say eggs, but—" "Pancakes it is." She started to pass him, but he grabbed her hand and kissed her. A quick happy-to-be-back sort of kiss that morphed into something more. She certainly wasn't complaining. He ended it, but didn't let her go. Brushing hair back from her neck, sending shivers over her skin, he said, "I've been dying to do that since I woke up, but I decided I'd better brush my teeth first." She laughed. She'd been thinking the same thing. While she cooked, he set the table and found butter and syrup, then moved the bacon from the rack to a plate. They were a good team, not just in making breakfast, but in all the things they'd accomplished that week. They did things differently, even thought differently, but they complemented each other. She'd finally learned to accept help, and for the first time, she understood what she'd been missing. She really didn't have to do everything alone. When the food was on the table and they were seated, Tate took her hand. "Mind if I pray?" "Please." He did, asking for a blessing on the food and praying for her safety. "Lead the police to whoever was behind last night's attack and help Misty and me understand what's going on with Parks and Dawson and that whole situation. Lord, nothing is hidden from you. Reveal the truth to us." More than anything else he'd said or done, that prayer told her Tate was on her side. When he finished, she held his hand a second longer. "Thank you for that, and for being here." He kissed her knuckles. "There's nowhere I'd rather be." They ate their breakfast and talked about nothing important. She was enjoying just being with him, seeing him smile, watching him enjoy the food she'd cooked. She'd almost forgotten Hughes's suspicions. Almost, but every few minutes, a little voice inside her head wondered if Tate's feelings were sincere. "It's just an act," the voice said. "He's using you to get information." She wanted to curse Hughes for planting those thoughts. There was zero reason not to believe Tate. He'd done nothing wrong, and he would never work with criminals. Even if not for her, he had ambitions. Why would he risk the future he craved for the sake of money? He wouldn't. Nor would he risk his reputation. No, there was no reason for Misty to suspect him. Once again, her feelings were steering her wrong. Thanks to the focus they'd given Dawson, Parks, and the IAF property that week, they were both behind at work. After breakfast, he set his laptop up in the living room while she settled at the kitchen table and read over new case files. After the shocking events of the night before and the short night of sleep, she found it difficult to focus and wasn't sorry when the phone rang around 11, giving her an excuse to step away from her computer for a little while. She stood and grabbed it from the counter. Misty Lake. "Hey, it's Nancy. Sorry I didn't get back to you last night." "No problem. Hold on a sec." She covered the mouthpiece with her hand. "Tate, it's my friend at the Secretary of State's office." He hurried into the kitchen. "Can I hear?" "Nancy, I'm going to put you on speaker. My friend Tate is here. He works with me at the DA's office, and he's been helping me figure all this stuff out." "That's fine." Misty tapped the speaker button and grabbed her notebook. "You're on with Tate." "Great. So here's what I learned. Remember Hothmarks?" "For Tate's benefit," Misty said. "The parent company that owns Redstone." "Exactly. They also own Thornbrook, the construction company." "Ah, that makes sense. When Redstone donated the land to IAF, Thornbrook set up a trailer on it. I guess IAF allowed them to keep the trailer there because they were going to do the construction." "Right," Nancy said. "A couple of Hothmarks execs are on the board of IAF." "Oh." Misty tried to work that all out in her head. Tate said, "Wait a minute. You're saying Redstone donated land to IAF, and Redstone is owned by Hothmarks, and Hothmarks has people on the IAF board, yes?" "There's nothing wrong with that," Nancy said. "Lots of business execs donate their time to nonprofits." So Hothmarks owned Redstone and Thornbrook, and had at least some affiliation with IAF. The pieces were coming together in Misty's mind. And the construction was paid for by a federal grant awarded to IAF. "What's that?" Tate straightened. "What grant?" "I guess I didn't tell you." Misty caught him up on the grant Nancy had discovered the day before, and how it was used. "You're saying you believe IAF misused grant money?" Tate clarified. "We think so." Misty explained how the money had been awarded for housing, but had been used to construct the office building. "The rest might be innocuous," Tate said, "but that's got to be a crime, to misuse federal funds." "I haven't had the opportunity to look into it," Misty said, "but I'm sure you're right. Hothmarks, via Redstone, donated land to IAF, who then hired another division of Hothmarks, Thornbrook, to build a fancy office building, improperly using federal funds intended to house refugees. Have I got it right?" "That sums it up," Nancy said. "We need names." Tate's tone was low and angry. He snatched a pen and pulled Misty's notebook close. "Who owns Hothmarks?" "The name Hothmarks is a mashup of last names," Nancy said. "I can't figure out how the first one fits, but the second two are family names, Thorne and Marks. My guess, doing some research, is they're the maiden names of the founder's mother and grandmother. I just can't figure out where the Haw came from. Tate's pen tapped an impatient beat on the notebook. Who is it? Who's the founder? Henry Humphrey. Humphrey. Wait. Tate straightened. Say that again? You heard me right, Nancy said. Henry Humphrey started Hawthmarks, Inc. He's deceased, and his brother runs the company now. Clark Humphrey. I bet you can guess who's on the board. Tate stepped back from the counter. Damien Humphrey? Keep going. I don't believe it. Tate's gaze flicked from Misty to the phone, his eyes wide. Misty vocalized what she knew he was thinking. Not Leland. Afraid so? Nancy's voice was solemn. The woman took no joy in exposing this. From what I can tell, the DA isn't personally involved in the running of the company, but Damien is, and he's the president of IAF. Whoa. Misty stared at Tate, but he didn't meet her eyes. His lips pressed into a thin white line. Emotions flitted across his face. Worry, anger, fear. She focused on the phone again. Nancy, can you send me everything you've dug up? I've already got it in an email, and I'm pressing send now. Thank you for doing this. Listen, I don't know what's going on here, but this is a powerful family. The fact that one of the members is the DA doesn't make them good. It makes them all the more dangerous. Be careful. Nancy wasn't wrong. A man had been murdered. A young woman, too. If Leland Humphrey was behind any of the events, then this conspiracy, there was no other word for it. It was more insidious than she'd ever imagined.
Chapter 29. Tate continued to stare at the phone long after Misty ended the call. It couldn't be. Surely Leland Humphrey wasn't involved in this whole mess. But the company, Hawthmarks, seemed to be. By the surprised, almost eager expression on Misty's face, she was convinced they had uncovered some diabolical plan. This is it, she said. This is what links them all. And I know you didn't mean to, but you told Leland where I was, right? Let's not jump to any conclusions. Misty's expression shuddered. Jump? I don't have to jump anywhere. It's obvious. What are you saying? Tate had worked for Leland Humphrey for years. The man had never been anything but straightforward and above board. Tate trusted his boss. He believed in him. Had Tate judged him wrong? Maybe, but he wasn't sure. Damien is up to something, Tate said, but that doesn't mean Leland is part of it. Can you really see him doing any of this stuff? He's the district attorney. His job is to put bad guys away. You really think? Yeah, I really think. You're so bent on impressing him and ingratiating yourself with him. That's not fair. Tate's anger bubbled up. He's my boss. Of course I'm trying to impress him. You should be too. You're too close to it. Misty's tone didn't soften the slightest. You can't see what he's doing. What is he doing? Even your friend said he's not involved with running any of the companies. He probably has nothing to do with anything. If he wasn't involved before, he obviously is now. When he found out the Dawson case had been assigned to me, he asked you to assist. When have you ever been asked to help me, or any of the ADAs on anything? You were falling behind. A little, but not so much I needed you to ride in on your white horse and rescue me. I didn't ask for this whole idea about him firing me. That doesn't fly either. Misty latched onto this idea like a train, and it was racing out of the station. I do my job, and I do it well. I'm conscientious and consistent and capable. My last review, I was given high marks. Leland has always been happy with my work. Yeah, since I was kidnapped, it's taken me a little while to get my feet back under me. But nobody's been hounding me to close my cases faster. Until last Friday, my pace wasn't a problem for anyone but me. All of a sudden, after I was assigned the Dawson case, Leland decided I needed help, and he chose you. Why do you think that is? He told us why. Tate worked very hard to keep his tone even. He thought we were friends because I'm the one who notified your sister that you'd been kidnapped. I'm the one who picked her up and drove her to Maine and stayed with her until we knew you were safe. You know why I did that? Because he asked you to. No, I offered. I insisted. Because even though you've never liked me, you could barely stand me before this week. I always respected you. I always wanted to be your friend. And when I found out you'd been kidnapped, Tate swallowed the anger dying to claw its way out of his mouth. I cared about you, as a friend, and now it's... He let his voice trail, not sure how to define their relationship, which he could feel unraveling. Leland wanted me to help you because, as far as anybody could tell, I was your only friend at the DA's office. She blinked. He didn't miss the wounded expression that crossed her features. Regret rose, a drop of cold water, sizzled by flames of frustration and fury. Leland knew you'd talk me into dropping the Dawson case so we wouldn't learn any of this stuff. Tate took a breath, praying for patience and understanding. I'm not saying you're wrong, but your evidence is circumstantial. She started to argue, but he spoke over her. You might be right, but you might not. I've always liked and respected Leland, the same way I've always liked and respected you. Her mouth opened, but he lifted a give me a second hand. She did, thank God. He needed to tread carefully. He cared about Leland, and he cared about his job. But Misty'd somehow jumped ahead of both of those. He had to watch his words, his actions. He had to be careful not to say or do anything that would cause a rift between them. His father and his sister, though always polite to one another, treated each other like one might a spooked animal, gentle but never familiar. From them, Tate had learned that some actions, even if forgiven, would never be forgotten. They were father and daughter, and their relationship had never recovered from Hannah's decision to quit school and move out, and Dad's cruel words when she did. That knowledge, coupled with his growing feelings for Misty, were cold water on the blaze inside him. Misty studied him, curiosity and wariness in her expression. He smiled at her and saw her shoulders relax. If somebody came to me with circumstantial evidence pointing to you being a criminal, I'd be just as reluctant to accept it because you're my friend. Leland has been my boss since I graduated from law school. He's never given me any reason to distrust him. She tilted her head to the side. You really don't think this is a reason? I know you're convinced, but I'm not. He stepped toward her and reached out. I don't want to fight with you. Can you and I still be together, even if we don't agree on everything? Because if we can't, then we probably ought to end this right now. She looked at his hand, then at his face. Finally, she closed the space between them and slid her palm against his. Whatever Leland's motive, I'm glad he assigned us to work together. I'm glad we've gotten to know each other. And this summer, it meant something to me when you drove Crystal to Maine and stayed there with us for so long. Knowing you did it because you wanted to be there, it means something. He brushed a strand of Misty's hair behind her shoulder, then shifted closer. When she didn't balk or push him away, he pulled her against his chest, thankful for the connection. Misty hugged him back. She stepped away. I think Leland telling you my job and your career are on the line proves he understood at least that the Dawson case was related to his family's company. Tate considered it, conceded she was probably right. Maybe Leland doesn't realize there's more to it than simple bribery. Maybe he's doing Damien a favor. Misty's eyes brightened. His brother. Damien. Don't you remember? They were on the phone when we went to the conference room last Friday. What did Leland say? Something about, my brother always has something going on. They were talking about some event. She gasped. I know exactly what it is, too. She grabbed her notebook and flipped back a couple of pages. Yes, right here. She jabbed the paper with a fingertip. The IAF property out in Hopkinton, Hearts and Homes. They're having a grand opening for their new rec center, which Thornbrook built. The guy from the construction company told me that they were having an event out there. They had constructed another building for them. This must be the event Leland was talking about. Knowing about a grand opening event and knowing what you and I have uncovered are two very different things, Misty. There's nothing wrong with him supporting his brother. It doesn't mean he knows anything about the crimes. I can't believe you're being so stubborn about this. You're blinded by ambition. He was not, was he? Tate hadn't remembered that Leland had been on the phone with Damien when they'd walked into the conference room because he had been so excited to be called in to see the boss. Between hoping to impress Leland and hoping to impress Misty at the same time, he hadn't been paying any attention to what Leland was saying. Maybe Leland was involved. Maybe Tate's ambition and loyalty were keeping him from seeing the truth. If Leland was crooked, if he'd sent those men after Misty the night before, the thought of it burned in his chest. Look, Misty laid her warm hand against his forearm. This obviously makes you very uncomfortable. I'm going to settle the Dawson case as soon as his lawyer gets back to me. That's what Leland asked you to do. Maybe you should go. Let me take it from here. What? No. He studied her face, tried to figure out what she was thinking. He saw indecision there. This was typical Misty behavior, not trusting anybody to help, thinking that only she could do it right, whatever it happened to be. I thought we were past this. Do you want me to go? Do you want to? It was a fair question. He wasn't exactly eager to dig up dirt on his boss, but Misty was in danger. He needed to stay with her. He needed to know she was safe. She was watching him closely. I don't want to pull you into this if you're not on board. I'm on board with finding the truth. I'm just not sure we know all of it yet. But I want to stay with you. I want us to do this together. He raked his hands through his hair. Don't mistake caution for fear. You might be right about all of it. I don't know. Let's just think about it, pray about it, and consider what we should do from here. Together, okay? He'd hoped to see relief in her expression, but she was still torn. She wanted his help, but she also wanted to do everything her way. The problem was, her way wasn't going to work. They had no evidence that Dawson had beaten up Layla Parks, and they had no evidence that Dawson or Parks had been involved in the listening device planted in Misty's apartment. Reyes still hadn't gotten back to them about the men who'd attacked the night before. Who knew if they could be linked to this whole mess? There were still too many puzzle pieces missing to make out the whole picture. So though Misty was acting like they'd blown some big conspiracy wide open, Tate wasn't convinced. And it wasn't just his worry for his job or hers. It was entirely possible that Damian Humphrey was doing something illegal, and Leland had no idea. Tate needed to figure that out before Misty went and lost them both their jobs. Tate led Misty to the living room, where they asked God for wisdom to know how to proceed. The more he prayed, the more convinced he was that he needed to reach out to Leland directly and talk about some of the more innocuous things they'd learned. He thought he'd be able to gauge Leland's guilt or innocence by the way he reacted. He was trying to figure out how to explain his plan to Misty when the buzzer sounded. She hopped up and pressed the intercom. Yes, it's Detective Reyes. She pressed the button, turning to Tate with wide eyes. Maybe this is it. Maybe she'll have information to tie the whole thing together. Misty seemed eager to prove their boss was crooked. The idea that Leland could be involved in all this, not just IAF's misuse of federal funds, but 2 murders, made Tate physically sick. She swung the door open, and the detective moved past the guard into the apartment. Like every other time he'd seen her, she wore a business suit that looked too warm for the summer day. She nodded to Tate but focused on Misty. How you doing? Ready to hear what you've learned. Let's sit. She settled in the chair, and Tate and Misty took the sofa. We identified the 2 men. Reyes rattled off names Tate had never heard before. It didn't take long to get them to admit they work for Griffin. Misty stiffened. Kyle Griffin? Right. The detective looked confused by her question. Does that surprise you? No, but the words sounded tentative. Clearly, Misty'd been sure Dawson, or maybe even Leland Humphreys, had been behind the attack. What was their plan? Tate asked. Reyes kept her focus on Misty. Griffin paid them to break in and intimidate you in order to get you to drop the case against him. They swear they weren't going to hurt you. But they were going to have to get past the guards, she said. They thought they could dispatch one pretty easily. They weren't going to kill him, just incapacitate him. Who knows how? They hadn't counted on the second guard. Was it the same guys who shot at her at the coffee shop? At Reyes's nod, Tate asked, was that the plan then? That's what they claim. Reyes still spoke to Misty. They said they were going to pin you and your guards down, at which point Griffin was going to yell at you to drop the case, or the next time would be worse. They swear they weren't trying to shoot anybody, which tracks with what our experts tell us. Misty was nodding silently. Tate couldn't tell if the news had upset her or just surprised her. Either way, she seemed to need a minute to pull herself together. They underestimated the guards, he said. Twice. Reyes's lips twitched as if she might smile. Griffin is arrogant. His punks are just stupid. Stupid but dangerous, Tate said. Mm-hmm. This is good news, Ms. Lake. The thugs are being charged. Griffin's in custody. I can't see a judge offering him bail after this. You might not be able to get him on the stalking charge, but conspiring to have your home invaded and intimidate you should get him put away for a while. Did you uncover any connection between Griffin and Raoul Dawson? No, should I have? What about Freddie Parks? Are they connected in any way? At Reyes's head shake, she said, Damian Humphrey? Reyes's curious gaze flicked to Tate. He wasn't sure what to say. Misty was so intent on proving her theories about the Humphrey family, her vision was distorted. She was seeing conspiracy everywhere. As far as we can tell, Reyes said, the two cases aren't connected. But you still consider them two cases, Misty clarified. The two attempts to intimidate me aren't connected to the intruder at my apartment. Correct. We still have no leads on that. Misty frowned. Tate was almost afraid of the answer, but he asked the question that had been humming in the back of his mind anyway. Do you know how they figured out she's staying here? You were very helpful on that front, Reyes said. I talked to your friend Clinton Lowe this morning. He admitted that Griffin paid him a visit Friday morning. To Misty, she said, he asked him where you'd been. Apparently someone had been watching the DA's office, waiting for you to show yourself, but you never did. Lowe told him he had no idea, but he said Griffin made him feel unsafe. The detective's rolling eyes accompanied the air quotes. And so he mentioned that he didn't know where you were staying, but Tate might. I didn't tell Lowe that. Tate turned to Misty. Have you talked to him? Never, if I can help it. He overheard it, Reyes said. He claimed he happened to be walking by when you and Leland were talking Thursday. I suspect he was eavesdropping, like you said. Then they followed me after work yesterday, Tate said, and I led them right here. Like an idiot. Inadvertently, Reyes's eyes were kind. One of the guys told me Griffin was the one who figured out which apartment to look in. What about Jeffrey Kofer? Misty asked. I'm not the lead on that investigation, but Klein hasn't made any arrests. We're still looking for Parks, but wherever he is, he's hiding well. You still think it was him? Tate asked. I do. Last I heard, Klein did too. The detective pushed to her feet. At least we got those 3 bad guys off the street. Of course, 2 of them will probably cut a deal for cooperating. As long as Griffin gets put away, Misty's voice brightened just a little. I'll let Melanie know that she and her kids don't have to worry about him anymore. It's a step in the right direction, Reyes said. But with Freddie Parks still out there, I recommend you keep your bodyguards. I will, Misty said. Don't worry. And Tate would be sticking close. He and Misty might not agree on everything, but that didn't change how he felt about her. If he had to risk his job to make sure she was safe, he'd do it. One thing was clear to Tate. Misty wasn't thinking clearly. This doesn't change anything. She paced across the small living room. So what if Leland didn't send those guys last night? Jeffrey Kofer's dead. Maybe we should just go public with everything we know. And throw mud at a bunch of people who may or may not be guilty? At the flash of irritation in her eyes, he lifted a hand. We might have to go that direction. Right now, we don't have enough information. Your loyalty to Leland is blinding you. She paced to the far side of the room and turned to face him. He stood. Your obsession with destroying your boss, this has nothing to do with that. If Leland is guilty, then I'm going to prove it. What if he's not? What if you go public with all this information, smear him and his family, lose him his job? What if you do all that and he's not guilty? He'll have a chance to prove his innocence. He shouldn't have to prove his innocence, Misty. We should consider him innocent until proven guilty. She brushed off his words with a wave of her hand. You know what I mean. If he didn't do anything wrong, then going public with all of this won't hurt him. That's not true. If any of this goes to court, maybe he'll be found not guilty. But meanwhile, what'll that do to his reputation? Are you so certain you're right that you're willing to destroy a man's life? A murderer? Oh, come on! Tate couldn't help the derision in his voice. Do you really believe Leland Humphrey had Jeffrey Kofer murdered? We don't know what. Exactly, Tate said. We don't know. So let's just settle down and think. If looks were claws, he'd be bleeding. I'm not saying we drop it, Tate said. I'm saying we keep investigating until we have evidence we can use. If that evidence leads us to Leland, he lifted his hand to stop the interruption he could see forming on her lips. Beyond guilt by association and the fact that he assigned me to help you, then I'll help you bring him down, okay? Except you don't think he's guilty. I haven't made up my mind because I don't have enough information. She tapped her foot on the floor. Fine, we'll keep digging. But where? That was the question. They needed to stop repeating the same argument and think. We're both behind on our other cases, he said. Let's work on those. Put this on the back burner for the day. Maybe an idea will present itself. Talking the thing to death isn't helping. Slowly she nodded. I'm not dropping it. I never thought you would. He added a smile, but she didn't return it, just went back to the kitchen and settled in behind her laptop. Tate did the same in the living room. He needed to think. They couldn't get access to Hallmark's books, but all nonprofits' financial statements were available to the public. He navigated to the IRS website and managed to find the International Aid Foundation's information. He perused the form. As executive director, Damian Humphrey was earning, yikes, over $400,000 a year. Other employees had six-figure salaries, though none nearly as high as Leland's brother. Tate was no expert in analyzing these kinds of documents, but from what he could tell, a lot of money was coming into IAF, and less than a quarter of it was being used to support refugees. Maybe those salaries were necessary, though. Maybe the IAF employees were specialists who could earn even more in the private sector. Tate needed help from somebody who knew more about nonprofits. He snatched his phone and dialed. Dad answered right away. How you doing? I need your help. Anything, Dad said. You know that. Is there anybody at your firm who can analyze a Form 990 for me? It's the IRS's nonprofit. I know what it is. What are you looking for? Any red flags, anything that looks off. I think this nonprofit might have misused federal grant money, so evidence of that, or proof I'm wrong. I'm concerned about the employees' salaries too. When do you need it? As soon as possible. I know it's Saturday, but no problem. Dad had always been eager to help his kids. What would it be like to have a father like Misty's, one who squashed their dreams and their security? He couldn't imagine. Dad had not only always been eager to help, but when he had a problem, he wasn't afraid to ask for it. Tate had seen that modeled his whole life. Misty, meanwhile, had learned early on that most people couldn't be trusted, especially men. I'll find somebody to look into it, Dad said. It's important this stay quiet. Then you owe me $1 and my firm is representing you. I'll mail you a check. Dad chuckled. Send the information over. We'll get back to you today. When Tate hung up, Misty was standing in the doorway. I'm having someone at Dad's firm look into IAF's financials. She squinted in that suspicious way of hers. Was she really worried his father couldn't be trusted? But then her expression shifted to a smile. Good idea. Tate forwarded the form to his father's email address. I thought we were taking a break from thinking about it. You're right. He closed the laptop. I just thought of that and decided to get it done. I should have thought to look up that information earlier. Her gaze flicked to the hallway. I'm having trouble keeping my eyes open. You going to take a nap? A shower should wake me. Is it all right if I stay? Of course. She wandered down the hall. A few minutes later, the water turned on. Tate tried to turn his attention to his other cases, but found he couldn't focus on them. The question of Leland's guilt or innocence kept nagging at him. Had Leland really assigned Tate to assist Misty because of the Dawson case? And if so, how much did he know about Raoul Dawson? Or, for that matter, IAF and what they were up to? How could Tate find out for sure what Leland knew? He considered the question, but the only answer was obvious. Tate needed to talk to him. If he was careful with how much he shared and how he shared it, maybe he'd be able to gauge the DA's involvement. If Leland was innocent, then Tate would try to convince Misty to tell him everything they knew. They could ask Leland for access to Hallmark's books and find proof that IAF had misused the grant money. They might even get information that could prove the company was associated with Dawson and Freddie Parks. Once they had proof, Misty, Tate, and Leland could go to the authorities together. That might protect Leland's position as DA. though ultimately that would be up to the people of Suffolk County. Tate wanted to bring down the bad guys, and he wouldn't mind coming out of this situation with him and Misty looking like heroes. On the other hand, if after talking to Leland, Tate suspected the DA was involved, then the question would be, to what extent? Had he hired people to break into her apartment and bug it? Had he been involved in the Layla Parks assault? In Jeffrey Kofer's murder? If so, then Tate would bring him down.
Chapter 30. Misty dried off after her shower and dressed. Lack of sleep and the heavy breakfast had weighed her down, but the shower had revived her. She brushed her hair and towel-dried it, not in any rush. Taking a little time away from her laptop helped her understand Tate's point of view. She'd accused him of blind ambition, but that wasn't fair. There was nothing wrong with wanting to be successful, and maybe he was right to take a more cautious approach. Though she was convinced Leland had asked Tate to assist her because he wanted the Dawson case settled quickly, it was possible the DA didn't know anything about the rest of the stuff they'd uncovered. Sure, it would be wrong for him to try to influence a case in which his family's corporation played a part, but he wouldn't be the first DA or prosecutor to overlook a crime for personal reasons. It was wrong, but not villainous. They needed someone on the inside at Thornbrook, and IAF, if possible, who could share internal records, someone who could gain access to information she and Tate couldn't get. They needed a whistleblower, which meant they needed to get to know people within both organizations. It could be a long process, but in this kind of game, there were no points awarded for speed. If it took weeks, even months, as long as they got to the truth. In the end, it would be well worth the wait. She couldn't keep hiding out. Fortunately, since Griffin was in custody, now was the perfect time to return to work. If she was right and her intruder had hoped to get information about the Dawson case, and if she settled it, everything could go back to business as usual. She wasn't sure what to do about the bodyguards. She'd have to pray about that, maybe talk it through with Tate and Summer. Meanwhile, she and Tate would have to use their spare time finding people on the inside to get them the information they needed to prove what they'd learned. Or keep digging themselves. It wasn't a perfect plan. It was barely a plan. But like a seed that wouldn't grow unless planted, her plan wouldn't take shape until she put it into motion. And she knew exactly how to start. She crossed the hallway into the bedroom and dialed, hoping someone would answer on Saturday. The line connected a few moments later. She recognized the gruff voice. "Mr. Begley, it's Misty Lake. We spoke the other day. I've been doing a lot of research on hearts and homes, and I'd like to know more. You mentioned some kind of grand opening? Tomorrow night? You want I should get you an invite? I'd love that if it's not any trouble. 2 invites if you can swing it." "No prob. They gave us a whole bunch. I'll email them to you." "That'd be great." She gave the man her email address. "I guess I'll meet you tomorrow." After she hung up, she hurried down the hall to tell Tate. By the sound of it, he was on the phone. She approached quietly so as not to interrupt. "Not at the office," Tate said. "Somewhere private. What about that place where we celebrated Barnard's retirement?" Who was he talking to? Someone from work, obviously. "Soon." A pause and then, "Wow, no, that's great. You should call Misty and tell her yourself. She'll be glad." She started to step into the room to get his attention. She wasn't in the habit of eavesdropping. "It's about one of the cases you asked me to look at," Tate said. She froze. He was talking to Leland? "It's got to be in person." Tate leaned over the coffee table and jotted a note. "Listen, don't tell anybody we're meeting, okay?" Tate ended the call, then looked up. When he saw her standing there, his face paled. And she knew. She knew. "Get out." "It's not what you think. I was going to tell you." She stepped closer. "So that wasn't Leland?" "It was, but I was going to—" "What? Lie to me about it? Come up with some reason why you had to run out, and then meet with Leland so you could tell him everything?" He stood and scooted out from behind the coffee table. Where his skin had paled a few moments before, now his cheeks turned red. "I'm trying to help." "Better take a bottle of water so your mouth doesn't get too dry, all that bootlicking." He took a step back. His jaw worked like he was trying to grind out the anger. No matter what I do, you're never going to trust me. Why would I trust you? She gestured to his cell phone. This is what I get for trusting you. I just want to gauge what he knows. That's all. Right. By warning him so he can protect himself and his family, ought to be great for your career. Tate's mouth opened, then snapped shut. That's what you think of me? What else could I think? You could try assuming the best about a person, not the worst. I did that, and look where it got me. Betrayed. I didn't. Get out. He stepped toward her. Don't do this. Just let me. I want you out. She said the words loudly enough for the bodyguard to hear. A moment later, the door swung open, and Jones stepped inside. You need help, Ms. Lake? Tate looked between the hulking man in the door and her. If you'd let me explain. I understand where your priorities lie. This was what she got for accepting help. This was what she got for trusting anybody. If it was me against bad guys, maybe you'd be on my side. But me against the boss. You'll choose your career every single time. That's not what's happening here. Right. Let's go. The bodyguard stepped toward Tate, who backed away, lifting his hand. Let me get my things. He sat on the couch and snapped his laptop closed. Sliding it into his bag, he looked up at her. If I were trying to hide something from you, do you really think I'd have made that call sitting in your living room? You didn't talk to me before you called him because… He gathered his papers, shoved them in the bag, and stood. Because I knew you'd be against it, but that doesn't mean it's the wrong play. Go then, have a nice little chat. Just don't come back. I'm on your side here. She crossed her arms. There was nothing else to say. The bodyguard said, Come on, let's go. Tate gave her a long look. She would swear she saw sadness in his gaze, but what was he sad about? Her catching his betrayal? Probably. He grabbed the handle of his bag and headed for the door. He turned at the threshold. I would never betray you, Misty. I hope someday you understand that. This thing, he gestured between them, could be something amazing. Or at least… He blew out a long breath and stepped away, muttering as he walked out. Misty stared at the closed door a long time, Tate's last words resonating in her heart. It could have been.
Chapter 31. Walking, maybe stomping was the right word, down the Back Bay sidewalk, Tate tried to figure out what in the world had just happened. He'd planned to tell Misty about the meeting, that she thought he hadn't, that she'd gone so quickly to believing he'd betrayed her, said more about her than it did about him. Maybe he should have told her before he called Leland. Fine. Maybe. But she should have let him explain. Not kicked him out of her apartment, out of her life, without a second thought. He had half a mind to forget the whole thing. Why should he stick his neck out to get more information? Why risk his job for her? He should cancel the meeting with Leland, go home, have a nice normal weekend. He could go back to work Monday as if he'd never learned any of this stuff. But of course he wouldn't. He wiped sweat from his brow. The mid-afternoon sun wasn't that hot, but the humidity was killing him. He probably should have taken the tea. Anger was clouding his judgment. Leland had been at the office when Tate called. He'd suggested they meet at a restaurant close by, but Tate hadn't wanted their conversation to be seen or overheard. They settled on a place near Faneuil Hall. It took Tate nearly a half hour to walk there. By the time he reached the historical marketplace teeming with tourists, sweat was dripping down his back. Great way to impress the boss. But that wasn't his goal, not this time. He was early, but Leland was already there, seated in a booth on the far side of the packed seafood restaurant. The diners were loud enough to nearly drown out the music playing overhead. The scents, grilled, fried, and raw fish, didn't mix well with the frustration churning in Tate's gut. It was too warm in the old brick building, though most of the diners didn't seem to mind. Tate slid into the booth, and Leland nodded to a beer on the table, moisture dripping down the glass and pooling on the cardboard coaster. Wasn't sure if I should order you one. Not today. Tate wasn't much of a drinker, and certainly not in the middle of the afternoon when he was working, and ticked off. A server approached and Tate ordered a glass of water. "What are your specials?" Leland smiled at the college-age woman, relaxed as could be. She rattled off a few options, none of which appealed to Tate. "You know what you want?" Leland asked. He glanced at the menu, picked the first thing that caught his eye. "Lobster roll and French fries." "Baked haddock," Leland said. The woman took their menus and left. "First," Tate said, "thanks again for dealing with Clinton." On the phone, Leland had said he'd fired the other ADA after learning he'd told Griffin how to find Misty. "It means a lot. His dad and I go way back." Leland's jovial expression shifted into a frown. "But we need to know we can trust each other. What kind of guy rolls over on his coworker like that? Where's his loyalty?" Loyalty. Tate had always prided himself on loyalty. But how could he be loyal to both Misty and Leland, to both his job and his values? "Have you told Misty yet?" Tate asked. "I called, but she didn't answer." He stamped out the twinge of worry. Misty had probably just avoided talking to the man she was convinced was corrupt. "Let's get to it," Leland said. "What's so important we had to talk today, and so secret that it had to be here?" "Not that I'm complaining. Cecilia's visiting the grandkids, so I was on my own for lunch anyway." "I need to ask you about a case." Leland gave him a go-ahead nod. Tate should have used the half-hour walk to pray about this meeting, rather than stewing about the argument with Misty. The server dropped off a basket of rolls and Tate's glass of water, and he took a long sip, using it to cool off and get his head in the game. He set the glass down. "The Dawson case." Leland spread his napkin on his lap. "Has she closed that yet?" "She's waiting for a call back from opposing counsel." "So what's the problem?" "Did you know Raoul Dawson works for Thornbrook Construction?" Though Leland's eyes gave nothing away, the skin around his lips tightened. "If I'm not mistaken," Tate said, "Thornbrook is a subsidiary of your family's corporation." No surprise on Leland's face. If anything, he seemed to relax. He leaned forward. "This is why I stepped away from the business when I ran for DA. Not that they're doing anything illegal, of course, but people are always quick to accuse. I'm trying to avoid even the appearance of impropriety." He tipped his beer toward Tate. "And this conversation is why I know you'll be great in the white-collar division. Digging deep like that, looking for connections, your skills are wasted where you are." Tate's heartbeat thumped, and not because the promotion he craved felt within reach. The misdirection, focusing on Tate's career rather than the underlying question. Leland said, "Misty isn't great at differentiating between what's important and what's not. I don't care if the guy's prosecuted, but I'd rather it not go to trial. It would be embarrassing if the press got a hold of the information." "Is that why you asked me to help her? Because you wanted me to encourage her to settle it?" "She needs to work with somebody like you, somebody who can teach her how to prioritize." Tate did his best to keep his expression neutral. Misty was right about some of it, but was she right about the rest of it? "I appreciate your discretion. It shows maturity and wisdom." "Thank you, sir." There was that boot-licking tone Misty must hate. Leland, however, visibly relaxed. "Can I ask something else?" "I have nothing to hide." "Did your brother ask you to intervene?" Now a wrinkle appeared between Leland's eyebrows. He set down his roll. "Why do you ask?" "According to Zachary Hardy, the guy Dawson attempted to bribe, the property in question is owned by IAF. Damien's on their board, right? I just wondered if maybe he was worried about blowback." Leland's eyebrows lifted. An invitation to say more? Or maybe a dare? Tate had never been one to back down from a dare. "According to Hardy, he was transferred out of that job, and his replacement issued all the permits. The office building was constructed." "It is an office building, right?" "It is." Leland's voice was flat. "I went by there the other night." Leland straightened the tiniest bit. "What night?" That wasn't the question Tate had expected. "Wednesday." "What time?" "I guess it was maybe 8 or 8:30. Dusk." "Why?" "Place was broken into that night. Did you see anything unusual?" "I'd never been there before, but everything looked fine to me." "What were you doing there?" That was the question he'd anticipated. Hardy told us the building didn't belong there. I guess he was defending his decision to deny the permits. I wanted to have a look myself. He figured it wasn't a good idea to bring Misty into this. What did you think? Tate shrugged. It's impressive. I'm glad it finally got built. Leland took a bite of his roll. No. Hardy seemed to think the building didn't meet the neighborhood's codes, and he was transferred for not issuing the permits. True or not, the accusation is out there. I've been wondering if maybe Damien... Tate shrugged, acted like he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. This was where it got interesting. If Leland seemed confused or gave the impression he'd look into Hardy's claims and Tate believed he was sincere, then he'd conclude Leland was probably innocent. But if he didn't, Tate prayed for discernment. He prayed the spirit would help him judge truth from lies. Leland sipped his beer, studying Tate over the top of the glass. Despite the festive mood, tension stretched between them. Are you accusing me of something? Or my brother? It's just curious, that's all. I mean, I talked Misty into letting it go because there's nothing there. Certainly nothing criminal. Right, Leland said. I'm thinking, Hardy? Was that his name? Zachary Hardy. He must not have been very good at his job, which was why he was replaced, and why the permits were ultimately issued, without the need for any money to change hands. So Damien didn't have anything to do with Hardy being punished for reporting. Who said he was punished? Well, Tate lifted a shoulder and let it drop. Hardy did, but if he wasn't good at his job, then it makes sense he was transferred. Exactly. Leland added a nod to the word as if to punctuate it, effectively ending the discussion. Their meals were served, and Leland thanked the server and waited until she'd walked away. He snatched the salt and sprinkled it over his meal. I appreciate that you came straight to me with your questions. You know how these things can morph into something they're not. He aimed the shaker at Tate. I appreciate how thorough you are. Tate figured Leland at least suspected it had been Misty's thoroughness, not Tate's, that had uncovered the connection to Leland and his family. Leland cut a bite of flaky fish. You can put this issue to bed now. Misty'll plead the case out on Monday, and then you won't have to work with her anymore. Rather than show his disappointment in both Leland and Misty, Tate ate a bite of his lobster roll. It melted in his mouth, but he barely tasted it. I haven't minded working with her. I bet. Leland winked, then dug into his baked potato. Even still, come Monday, you're going to be busy getting up to speed on your new job. You'll do great in white-collar crimes. Thank you, sir. His smile felt as brittle as clay, the words like sand in his mouth. That job had been Tate's goal since he'd started at the DA's office, which Leland well knew. So was the promotion a reward for a job well done, or payment to keep his mouth shut? The rest of lunch was torturous. Tate and Leland talked shop, Leland sharing some things Tate would need to know once he moved into prosecuting white-collar crimes. Tate tried to take in everything, hoping, when this was all over, he'd need the information, hoping that what happened next wouldn't destroy his career, all the while trying to figure out how much Leland knew. Maybe he didn't know everything about Thornbrook and IAF. Even so, he was obviously willing to use his position to protect his brother, IAF, and Thornbrook. Willing to use his influence to protect the corporation that had made his family rich. It didn't necessarily make him guilty of conspiring to commit assault or murder, but he wasn't innocent either. When they finished their meals, Tate pulled out his wallet, but Leland waved him off. It's on me, a celebration lunch for your new job. Thank you, sir, and thanks for the opportunity. The words came naturally and, he hoped, hid the suspicion buzzing in his brain. Tate left Leland and went straight to the tea station. He was still irritated enough with Misty that he considered keeping what he'd learned to himself, but he'd had lunch with Leland to find out what he knew so he could share the information with her. Maybe once he did, she'd realize she was wrong about him. And then what? They'd pick up where they left off? Not a chance. He'd liked her, had even thought she might be the woman he would spend his life with. But after she'd turned on him that morning, assuming the worst about him, he'd rather be alone, thank you very much, than live his life with someone like that. His phone dinged with an incoming text. Dad, just sent you an email. IAF salaries are suspicious, considering the lack of experience, especially the execs. Grant money was probably misused, but more investigation needed. Before Tate finished tapping out his reply, another text came in. The exec director is Damien Humphrey. Three dots signaled his father wasn't finished. I hope you know what you're doing. Tate stared at that last one a long time. He knew exactly what he was doing, risking his career in order to bring down his boss. Was he nuts? Maybe. But some things were more important than achieving success. If Leland Humphrey's family was guilty of everything Misty suspected, their sins needed to be exposed. His phone dinged again. 3 question marks. He replied, "Pray for me. I'm gonna need it." He exited the T at Kenmore Square and walked to Misty's sister's building. No bodyguard stood on the stoop, but sometimes they watched the door from a nearby car. Tate climbed the front steps and jabbed the apartment number. No reply, which might make sense if Misty knew it was him, but the building's security hadn't been upgraded to include cameras. He hit the button again. Someone stepped outside and he grabbed the door and let himself in. Maybe she was napping, or maybe she was avoiding everybody, not just Tate. He climbed to the 3rd floor and rounded the corner to her apartment. Jones wasn't there. Nobody stood guard. His heartbeat raced. He banged on the door. "Misty?" Nothing. He pressed his ear against the wood and listened, but no sounds came from within. Another door on the floor opened up, and a young mom stepped out, followed by a couple of school-aged kids. They bolted past her and ran down the stairs. She called after them, "Do not go outside until I get there." "We know," one of them yelled back. The woman locked her door, then turned to him. "If you're looking for the blonde, she took off." "Any idea where she went?" The woman shrugged. "She was pulling a suitcase, so I guess she's gone for good. A day too late, if you ask me." She started down the stairs. "My kids were up half the night with all that commotion." Misty was gone. Tate wasn't sure if he should be hurt or angry. Both, he decided. He pulled out his phone and texted her. "Where are you?" He sent it, waited for a response. But the phone never showed it as delivered. He sent another text, but the same thing happened. He dialed her number. The call went straight to voicemail, which meant either her phone was off or she'd blocked him. She'd blocked him. Fury coursed through his veins. What did Misty think? That he was going to lead her enemies to her doorstep? Did she really believe he'd put her in danger for the sake of his career? He was proud of himself for not voicing the words screaming in his brain. Fine then. He'd go home, go through the information himself, try to reach her via email. He was just as invested in getting to the bottom of this mystery as she was. The sooner they did, the sooner he could get on with his life and career, whatever was left of it, without Misty Lake.
Chapter 32. It had been hard enough making herself at home at Summer's apartment. This was going to be so much worse. Not the place. The place was amazing. At least it seemed so, though Misty hadn't gotten past the expansive foyer, with the stairway that led up multiple flights of stairs. She set her laptop bag on her suitcase. I didn't know there were any brownstones left in Boston that hadn't been converted to apartments. There aren't many. Jackie Coate bounced a baby on her hip, a little boy with bright red hair to match his mother's. He looked 5 or 6 months old and kept lifting his head from her shoulder to smile at Misty before hiding again. My family's owned this place since long before I was born. The child was precious, and the hidden place in Misty's heart, the place she always tried to pretend wasn't there, melted. Would she ever have a husband, a family? Would she ever find a man she could trust? Jackie led her past a dining room on one side, a living room on the other. Both were decorated as old and expensive places often were, as if the furnishings were as much a part of the space as the walls and fancy moldings. The tables and chairs seemed somehow both antique and unpretentious. Shelves overflowed with books. Magazines had been tossed haphazardly on the coffee table. The only thing that didn't seem to belong was the flat-screen TV. Jackie gestured to a door beneath the staircase. That leads to the basement. I converted it to a laboratory when I still lived here full-time. The washer and dryer are down there. Help yourself if you need them. What kind of lab? I own a medical device development company. Before I met Reed, I was a bit of a workaholic. She continued to the kitchen, which, unlike the rest of the first floor, had been fully upgraded. White cabinets, gray and white granite countertops, Stainless appliances? The fridge is mostly empty. You might find something in the pantry. She turned back to Misty. We're not here very much, and when we are, we usually order out. There's a market on the corner, not that they'll let you walk there. They meaning the bodyguards stationed outside the front and back doors. Summer had secured this place when Misty told her about Tate's betrayal. She'd called in tears, looking for comfort. Summer had responded in her typical Summer way. She'd been sympathetic, for a minute, then jumped into action, making sure Misty would be safe. As if Tate could be a threat. He might care more about his job than her, but he'd never hurt her. Since Leland knew where she'd been staying, and Misty was convinced Leland was, if not intimately involved, at least complicit in the crimes of his family's company, it seemed wise to find somewhere else to stay until this mess was cleared up. Please, Jackie said, help yourself to anything you want. Thank you, and for letting me stay here. I'm just glad we're in town. Not that you couldn't have come if we weren't. We'll be spending most of the day and tomorrow at the convention. Then we'll head back to Coventry. But you're welcome to stay as long as you need to. Tears filled Misty's eyes. She swiped them quickly. The shorter woman reached out and took her hand. I don't know all of what you've gone through, but I'm sure it hasn't been easy. I found my life in danger once, and it was terrifying. I don't know where I'd be if Reed hadn't been there for me. And last winter, your cousin saved Denise's life. Your sister kept our Ella safe from that mad woman. I wouldn't presume to know how you feel, but... Her words trailed. Was Misty's life in danger? Even if it was, thoughts of people coming after her hadn't sent tears to her eyes. She'd been weepy ever since she'd sent Tate away. She'd never felt so alone. Now, having this woman and her husband, along with Summer and Grant and John, all worried about her safety, she didn't know how to think about it. She was so accustomed to doing everything by herself. She'd finally decided to let someone get close, let someone help her, and look what happened. Misty had always been okay with the solitude of choosing her own path. But now, away from home, away from the office, with nobody to talk to about all the things she'd learned, the connection to this red-headed stranger meant something to her, more than she could articulate. Jackie squeezed her hand and then let go. Anyway, make yourself at home. Eat and drink whatever you can find. Read the books. You'll surely find something of interest. I don't have cable, but Reed's configured the TV to pick up local stations and gotten one of those internet-capable devices if you want to watch something. Here's the Wi-Fi code. She tapped a sticky note on the counter, then gestured around the pretty kitchen. You need anything else? No thanks. Let's head up then. Misty grabbed her suitcase and bag in the foyer and followed Jackie and the baby up the stairs. She'd met her and Reed the previous month at John and Denise's engagement party. Reed was Denise's ex-husband, Ella's father, which made them sort of distant family by marriage, or they would be after the wedding. Jackie had been quiet at the park that day, more of an observer than a participant. Misty hadn't given her much thought. She certainly never would have guessed the woman owned a house like this, or a lab, or a company that developed medical devices. Just went to show how wrong first impressions could be. They reached the second floor. It was different. The hardwood floor, very similar to the stairs, looked newer. The walls were freshly painted. Even the doors didn't match those below. We had a fire, Jackie said. We could have had everything restored perfectly, but the time and expense seemed needless. It's still beautiful. They did a good job. She walked down the hall, and Misty peeked into a bedroom and a second room lined with bookshelves, which also looked far newer than the brownstone. The center of the space held a crib and changing table. Jackie started up the next flight. You'll have the third floor to yourself. I apologize for the climb, but you should be comfortable up here. Your own room, plus there's a little sitting room and a bath. It's meant to be a guest suite. The baby was one of the quietest Misty'd ever seen. His eyes were bright, taking everything in. Sort of how Jackie seemed, silent and observant. Obviously, mother and son had more than just their red hair in common. Here we are. Jackie stepped aside, and Misty entered the bedroom. It was as large as the master bedroom below. She left her small suitcase by the door and her bag on a queen-sized four-poster bed with a pretty yellow quilt. A large highboy bureau was pushed against one wall. A small writing desk and chair near the bay windows would be a perfect place to work. "Not a lot of noise on this street," Jackie said. "And up here, you shouldn't hear much of it. It does tend to get warmer on the third floor. I hope you'll be comfortable." Misty turned and smiled. "It's lovely, thank you. Do you need anything?" "Not that I can think of." "Then this little guy and I will head back to the convention." She squeezed the baby's foot, eliciting a giggle. "We probably won't be home until after 8. There are some frozen things, but with everybody here, I suspect you'll need to call out for dinner." Who is everybody?" Jackie's light brown eyes rounded. "Didn't they tell you? Clearly not, though I'm surprised by your surprise. Obviously, Summer, Grant, and John are all on their way." She shifted the baby and glanced at her watch. "I bet they'll arrive in the next hour or so. Reiterate my offer for them to stay here, would you? I know Summer has her own place, but I have 2 bedrooms upstairs, plus a pull-out in the sitting room down the hall. Plenty of space." She looked around at the walls. "It'd be nice to see this place brimming with people. It's been a long time." "I'll tell them." "You have my number now," Jackie said. "Call if you need me." At Misty's promise to do that, the woman headed back down the stairs. A few minutes later, the front door opened and closed, leaving Misty alone in the giant home, feeling unsettled, slightly nervous, and, without Tate by her side, incredibly alone. She unpacked her few belongings, finding empty drawers in the bureau and plenty of hangers in the closet. She put her toiletries in the bathroom, then set up her laptop on the desk, all the while checking her phone. No messages from Tate, but then she'd blocked his number. Still, every time she saw the blank screen, her heart clenched a little. She missed him. When she'd stowed everything, she sat in front of her laptop and pulled up her email. There were 47 new emails, but the one from Tate caught her eye first. She clicked on it. "I have information about IAF and Leland. If you want it, call me." As if she'd trust anything Tate had to say. It was bad enough he knew everything they'd uncovered so far. She should have sent him away days before. She should have sent him away when she'd first felt him pressuring her to close the Dawson case. For all she knew, he'd been in on this conspiracy with Leland from the beginning. But she was curious about what Tate would say. More than curious. She tapped out a reply. "We can communicate through email." After hitting send, she busied herself with her other messages. She was halfway through deleting all the junk when his reply came in. "No, that was it, just no." Jerk. Fine then. She didn't care what he had to say. It was probably a lie anyway. He'd had someone looking into IAF's financial statements, but she could do that herself. She found the proper form on the IRS website and downloaded it. And groaned. She stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of them. Lack of sleep and the crazy events of the day, and the night before, had her fighting the pull of the mattress. The figures were starting to dance a little in her vision, when the faint ding of a bell gave her a great excuse to step away. A knock followed it. She hurried down the 2 flights to the door. "Who is it?" "It's the plumber," Summer said. "I've come to fix the sink." Misty swung open the door to her sister, smiling at the old line they used when they were kids. Summer stepped through and wrapped Misty in her arms. "Thank God you're okay." After a very brief hug, she stepped back and held her shoulders. "I can't believe you didn't call me after what happened last night. Someone came after you, and I had to hear it from Hughes." "Oh, sorry." Misty hadn't called, because she'd known how Summer would react. She should have known Hughes would tell on her. "You're okay? You're not hurt?" "I'm fine." "Good." Summer moved deeper inside, allowing Grant and John to enter. John wrapped her in a hug and held on tight. "Glad you're okay." Grant stepped in behind him and gave her a side hug. "Good to see you safe and whole. And not being held captive by madmen. It's an improvement." He smiled, looking little like the fierce warrior who'd rescued her that spring. The 2 men took up a lot of space in the foyer. "Come on in." "This place is amazing." To her sister, she said, "Have you ever been here before?" No, I knew Jackie had a place here, but her words trailed as they walked through the living area and into the kitchen. Wow. Wait till you see the rest of it. Jackie wanted me to tell you you're welcome to stay. Misty turned at the counter island to include the men in the invite. All of you, she has plenty of room. Grant and John are staying at my place, Summer said. I'll be here with you until I know you're safe. Tell us what happened last night. After Misty found cans of soda and filled a couple of glasses with water, the four of them sat at the small kitchen table that overlooked a rear courtyard. She told them about Kyle Griffin and the thugs who'd invaded her home, being very careful not to talk about, or even think about, the man who'd rushed to her side and then comforted her all night long.
Chapter 33. Tate had to quit waiting for his phone to ring. Obviously, Misty wasn't going to call him. Maybe he should just forward the information and let her run with it. But he needed to tell her about his conversation with Leland because why? What did it matter what she thought of him? It didn't, but it did. He wanted her to understand why he'd chosen to meet Leland. Tate wanted her to know she was wrong about him. Maybe deep down, he still hoped there could be something between them. Idiot that he was. After an hour in the gym, he showered and then plopped himself in front of the TV. But nothing held his interest. He tried to focus on a basketball game, but it turned into a blowout. He switched to a movie he hadn't liked all that much the first time around. He wasn't sorry when he checked his fridge and found it empty. He hadn't gone to the grocery store. He'd hardly been at his apartment since he'd saved Misty from walking in on that intruder a week before. What did she think? That he'd been part of a plot to plant listening devices? Probably. Grabbing his keys and phone, he headed for the door. A nice long walk in the summer evening air might help him take his mind off her and her ridiculous accusations. He'd go to his favorite burger joint. It would be packed on a Saturday night. The crowd noise would make him feel less alone. The elevator stopped halfway down, and an older couple stepped in. They were probably in their 60s. Gray hair, wrinkled skin, holding hands. Would he ever be one half of a gray-haired couple? A dad, a grandpa? Would he ever have what his father had? They reached the lobby, and the happily marrieds preceded him through the door. Tate paused when the heat of the summer evening hit him, breathing in the familiar sights and sounds and scents, pretending he wasn't wishing for anything else. A man bumped into him, and he turned, an automatic smile on his face, but fingers curled around his biceps and squeezed. A jab in his side was dull but insistent. The face, just inches from his, looked menacing and familiar. "Don't say anything." Freddie Park's voice was low. "Don't scream. Don't try to get help. Just walk with me to that car. I swear I'm not going to hurt you." An old Honda idled at the curb. A man sat in the driver's seat. Tate tamped down a rise of panic, breathed, prayed, hoped like crazy Freddie wasn't lying. Freddie had a round, unshaven face. He was about 5'9", shorter than Tate, but his barrel chest radiated power. They reached the car. "Climb in and slide to the far side." Tate did as he was told, and Park slid in beside him. The compact car's back seat felt extra cramped with the armed man inches away. As soon as the door closed, the driver hit the gas. He was probably in his mid-20s with curly light brown hair and a long nose. Tate couldn't see his eye color or even the shape of his face from the back seat, but he'd keep watching. He'd need to identify these people later, assuming there would be a later. Freddie blew out a breath. "Thanks for not fighting me." At the strange remark, Tate looked his way. He wore a dingy white t-shirt that revealed tattooed arms as thick as Tate's calves. In his hand, he held a short piece of pipe, the thing that had been jabbed into Tate's side. Not a gun. What a fool Tate was. He should have fought, or run. "I'm not going to hurt you," Freddie said, "but I need to talk to you, and I'm not trying to go back to prison. I was scared you were going to raise all sorts of commotion and get the cops after me." "Kidnapping is a felony whether you use a gun or threats and manipulation," Tate said, "so I'm thinking you are trying to go back to prison." Where the calm tone came from, he didn't know. It certainly belied the fear thumping in his chest. The driver made his way on surface streets toward the north end, winding along the narrow roads seemingly at random. Okay, fine. Freddie sounded annoyed. I'm not going back to prison yet, okay? I'm not going to hurt you. I need to talk to Misty Lake, and I know you know where she is. I don't. And even if I did, there's no way I'd tell you. Thank God, Misty had left her sister's apartment. No matter what this guy and his thug friend did to him, he wouldn't be able to tell them her location. If nothing else, at least Misty would be safe. Freddie didn't look angry at his response. His lips slipped into a smirk. Yeah, you know. Why would I? 'Cause you two are together, right? She's trying to find me, and you went up to Ma's on Thursday, and she told you about Layla and what Raoul done to her. She remembered your name and told me. But Tate hadn't mentioned Misty's name to Winnie Parks. I'm not denying that, and I'm not saying I don't know Misty. We're co-workers, but listen, Steele. Freddie's heavy eyebrows lowered and angled together. I got a lot of patience, but it runs out real quick when people lie to me. I might not look smart, but I'm not dumb. But how did he know Tate was lying? He swallowed his denial and tried a different tack. What makes you think Misty and I are together? Saw you two, didn't I? Outside the IAF building, holding hands. Leland said the building had been broken into that night. Freddie must have done it. But why? I remember her from court, Freddie said. Didn't know who you were, but then Ma said you went to see her Thursday, and I looked you up. Your picture's on the internet. Fine, Tate said. We were dating. We had a big fight today, and we're not anymore. I went to where she was staying this afternoon, but she's gone. She go home? We've been watching the building, waiting for both of you. Heartwarming, knowing their addresses were so easy to find. She's in hiding, Tate said. From you. I'm not gonna hurt her. The ex-con who'd beaten a man nearly to death had the nerve to look insulted. What? You're all about flowers and butterflies now? Did I hurt you? Tate glared at the short bit of pipe still in the man's hands. You forced me into your car. I get the distinct impression that you wouldn't like it if I tried to get out. To his friend, Freddie said, Pull over. The driver did, stopping beside one of the many Italian restaurants in this part of town. Pedestrians wandered by, some stopping to read the menu in the window. Go ahead, get out. Tate didn't know if this was a trick or what, but he wasn't going to wait to find out. He reached for the handle. Thing is, Freddie said, I think you and I are after the same thing. Tate pulled the handle. He'd feared maybe there'd be a child safety feature that would keep him trapped inside, but the door unlatched. Freddie grabbed his arm and held on tight. Tate barely kept himself from yanking away and diving out the door. Instead, he turned to the man beside him, lifting his eyebrows. You gotta listen to me. Parks didn't release him, but he eased his grip. Tate thought, hoped, he could leave if he wanted to, and if Freddie fought him, he could shout. There were plenty of people around to hear. Even still, he gave the hand on his forearm a pointed look. Freddie let go. You're trying to bring down the people who had that building built. Thornbrook and I, AF, right? 'Cause that's what I'm trying to do too. Sure you are. But the disbelief he'd tried to infuse his voice with didn't come. Because he didn't disbelieve. They killed my sister, Freddie said. And not just Layla. His eyes, the terrifying ex-con's eyes, turned red around the edges and filled with tears. Mr. Kofer was nothing but good to me. He got me out of jail even when I had nothing to pay him. And that lady who died, he swiped a hand down his face. Listen, man, I'm sorry I scared you. I know the cops think I hurt Mr. Kofer, but I didn't. And I'm not trying to hurt Miss Lake. I just thought, seeing you two at the building, then you going up to Ma's house, I thought we could work together. 'Cause I gotta bring them down, but I really don't want to end up in prison again. Or dead. I need help.
Chapter 34. Misty pulled another slice of pizza loaded with veggies from the box. Summer and John had already made themselves at home at Jackie's place. Though Misty hadn't known Grant well before tonight, he already felt like family. After she'd concluded the story about Kyle Griffin, the guys had decided they needed sustenance before they could go on. Summer had rolled her eyes playfully before calling out for 3 large pizzas. Misty wasn't sure she'd ever seen her sister do anything playfully before in her life. She liked this new Summer. Without the tough veneer she'd worn for years, she looked not only calmer, but more confident. In fact, she looked fabulous. Misty couldn't help it. She wiped her fingers on her napkin and reached across the table to touch Summer's sweater, which she'd slipped on over her t-shirt after complaining about the air conditioner. "Is that cashmere?" Summer's eyes sparkled. "You like it?" "It's gorgeous. The green looks so pretty with your skin tone. I'll get you one." She gave Grant a sidelong glance, then bent close like she was about to share a secret. "I'm thinking of starting a boutique." What?" She couldn't help the shock in her voice. "I know, crazy. But now that Grant has settled on the job with the Coventry PD, it looks like we'll be staying there. And there are no good clothing stores within 30 miles. The way she talked about herself and Grant, as if their staying together was a foregone conclusion, took Misty aback. Her sister had completely let her guard down. John cleared his throat. "Besides Hamilton's outlet store," he said, "which has everything a body could want, but is apparently not good enough for Her Majesty." Summer whacked him, and he feigned injury. At Grant's chuckle, Summer kissed his cheek. The love between them made Misty's heart hurt. "Hamilton's is fine for outdoor wear," Summer said, "and they have great everyday clothes, don't get me wrong. But the town needs high-end shops to appeal to the high-end tourists who come to visit. New resorts are going up by the lake. I think it could do well. Denise thinks so too." Misty couldn't help it. She laughed. "Because as a movie star, she has a real handle on the life of the everyman." John scowled and plopped down his meat-covered slice of pizza, clearly ready to take up his fiancée's cause. "She's totally down to earth," Summer said, beating him to it. Misty winked at John to show she was teasing. "Does she shop at the Hamilton outlet?" Summer and John traded a look. "Well, not unless there's a clothing emergency," Summer said. "But that's the point. She's not the only wealthy person who vacations in Coventry." John cleared his throat. "She lives there. Maybe not all the time, but—" "You know what I mean?" Summer's excitement seemed to fade a little. "It's just an idea." "It's a fantastic idea, sweetheart." Grant bumped her shoulder. "By the time you're done, the whole town will be decked out in high fashion." "I agree." Misty was happy for her sister's obvious bliss, despite a petty twinge of jealousy. "Especially if you can get me discounts." She eyed the sweater again, and Summer grinned. They'd agreed not to talk about anything important during dinner. Misty had plenty of time to tell them all about Hawthmarks and Thornbrook, and IAF later. For now, she was content to just be with her family. How had she survived so many years without her sisters in her life? Thank God they were restoring their relationship now. If not for the danger Misty still found herself in, she'd have invited Crystal to join them. Of course, Crystal would have spent the entire evening lecturing her to find a less dangerous job. But for 99% of the ADAs in the world, the job wasn't dangerous. Just bad luck that Misty landed in the 1%. Summer's phone rang, and she stood and grabbed it from her purse on her way out of the room. 10 seconds later, she returned. All amusement had faded from her expression. Her spine was straight, her eyes focused. The bodyguard was back as she held the phone out to Misty. "It's for you. I think you'd better put it on speaker." "What?" Who would be calling her on Summer's phone? She did and set it on the kitchen table. "Misty Lake." "It's Tate. We need to talk." "How did you— Why are you calling me? Can't you take a hint?" "I'm here with Freddie Parks. He needs to see you. Tonight." 30 minutes later, Misty followed her sister down a long hallway at the Green Beret Protection Service office, the company partly owned by Summer and John. Despite the bodyguards surrounding her, she had to fight the urge to flee. Freddie Parks was in the building. Freddie, who'd threatened to kill her, and who was wanted for murder. He was here, with Tate. How did they know each other? How long had they been working together? And why had they insisted that they needed to see her? Tate hadn't been willing to explain on the phone. She'd refused until Summer and John's partner had come on the line and encouraged her to hear them out. Apparently, he'd been alone at the office when Tate and Freddie had shown up and demanded he contact Misty via Summer. Summer and John trusted Bartlett, so Misty should too. But she'd never have agreed if not for the bevy of bodyguards. She followed her sister into a brightly lit conference room. The room was empty except for Tate, who looked up from a bundle of papers he'd been studying. He barely spared her a glance as he stood and held out his hand to her sister. "Good to see you again." Summer reintroduced him to Grant and John, whom he'd met in Maine after the kidnapping. He knew Hughes and Ian, of course. Misty sat on the far side of the table from Tate, not right across from him, but close enough that she could watch him. She didn't trust him. At all. The fact that he'd been working with an ex-con suspected of murder certainly didn't raise her opinion. Where was Freddie? Summer sat next to her. Beneath the table, she reached over to squeeze Misty's hand. John and Grant stood behind them. Hughes and Ian positioned themselves on the far side, behind Tate. Armed sentries there to protect her. Tate returned his attention to the stack of papers in front of him. Aside from the occasional scratching of his pen on paper, the room was quiet. The silence stretched like a tension line. Finally, an older man entered. Freddie wanted to get cleaned up a little. He glanced around the table until his gaze landed on Misty, then he crossed the room to her. "I'm Bartlett." She stood and shook his hand. "Sorry about this." "Not a problem." He returned to the door and poked his head out. "Well, come in. This is your party, after all." Freddie stepped across the threshold. Misty's stomach plunged at the sight of him. He wasn't particularly tall, but he'd bulked up in prison, all muscle and hate. Except, he smiled. "Thanks for coming. I should have just wrote everything in the letter." "You sent that warning?" she asked. He shrugged. "I didn't figure you'd believe me if you knew it was from me. Not that you should, and I'm not so good at explaining stuff on paper." Bartlett pulled out the chair across from her. "Have a seat." After Freddie did, Bartlett sat at the end of the conference table. "Go ahead." Bartlett spoke to Tate, who slid his papers aside. "I think Freddie should start." Tate angled his chair slightly and gave the man beside him a go-ahead nod. Freddie's Adam's apple bobbed. His gaze flicked above her head, presumably to John and Grant, who were probably glaring at him. He averted his eyes fast, to Bartlett at the end of the table, to Summer. He swallowed again. Tate gripped the man's shoulder. "Ignore everybody else. Just tell Ms. Lake what you told me." "Okay." He turned back to her. Misty had never looked this closely at him before. When she'd prosecuted his case, she hadn't cared what he looked like, only concerned about putting him away. When he'd screamed his threats at her, she'd just walked out of the courtroom as if he didn't matter. She looked now. He was big and built, but not scary, not the way he was looking at her. His hair was combed, his cheeks looked freshly shaved. He had a round face, and when he gave her a shy smile, dimples. He was a human being, a person who mattered. She had no idea what was going on, but if he had information, she wanted it. And he'd done his time. Maybe not as much as he deserved, but she was learning that the last thing anybody wanted was to get what they deserved. She was the recipient of mercy. She could extend it to this man. She stood and reached across the table. "We've never been properly introduced. I'm Misty Lake." He looked at her hand the briefest moment before standing and shaking it. "Ms. Lake, I'm Freddie." "Call me Misty." She sat again, and he did too. "Tate tells me you wanted to talk to me?" "You remember when I asked you to come see me?" "I'm sorry it took me so long to make the time." "You got better things to do than visit some loser in prison." "You're not a loser, Freddie, and I didn't have better things to do, just more pressing things. Though, in retrospect, I wish I'd gotten out there sooner." "So you know what happened, right? Tate and me been talking, and he says you guys worked it out. See, after that lady out at Hearts and Homes died, that wrecked me, you know? Like it's one thing to beat up a grown man. I should have felt bad about that, but..." He broke eye contact, shrugged. "I didn't feel much of anything back then. But a lady, a mom with kids who'd worked so hard to get here, she died 'cause of what I did." He blinked a couple of times, and his eyes turned red, like he was about to cry. Beside him, Tate said, "You mind if I tell everybody else what you're talking about?" Freddie gave Tate a grateful look. "Go ahead." Tate addressed Summer, Grant, and John. Misty figured Bartlett had already heard this story. Freddie was paid to intimidate a building inspector into glossing over some issues he found at the Hearts and Homes Refugee Building in Hopkinton. Beside Misty, Summer nodded. On the far side of the room, even Hughes seemed to lean in. "The man refused to budge," Tate said, "so Freddie beat him, badly. He ended up in ICU. After that, another inspector passed the building without a hitch. A year later, a carbon monoxide leak set off the alarms in the house. One woman was deaf." "Jamila Amen," Freddie said. "That was her name." "Right." Tate gave Freddie a kind glance. "Her kids were at a friend's house for the night. She didn't hear the alarm." "She died." Freddie's voice pitched high. "It was my fault, see? If I hadn't beat that guy up, how hard would it have been to fix that? The builders were just cheap is all, didn't care about those people, and I helped them. They had all those stories about the lady and her family on TV, all the stuff she had to go through to get her family to the States, and now those kids have no mom, and it's my fault." He banged a fist on the table. "My fault. I was so broken up about it, I went to see the prison chaplain, and he told me I could be forgiven. I just had to give my heart to Jesus. So I did, but the guilt didn't go away. I had to make it right." He closed his mouth, but his lips trembled. Misty couldn't help the tears that dripped down her cheeks. She swiped them away with her fingertips. "That's when you reached out to me. And Raoul. He was my best friend. I wanted to warn him I was going to tell what happened. I told him I wasn't going to name him, but that maybe he ought to get a lawyer or something. I didn't want to cause him trouble. But he told his boss, and Raoul or someone roughed up my sister, and—" Freddie looked at the ceiling, shook his head. Again, Tate gripped the man's shoulder and spoke to the room. His sister had an undiagnosed heart condition. The assault probably wasn't meant to kill her, but she didn't survive. Freddie swiped moisture from his face. Misty did the same. "I was scared for my mom and my niece, you know. I should have told before, but I couldn't let anything happen to them. Ma refused to hide. I was trying to learn to live with it, and then Mr. Kofer, he said maybe he could get me out. And he did, and I finally talked Ma into going away. Moved her out of state where Raoul and his people can't hurt her. And now I gotta take him down. I gotta." "I understand." Misty worked to get her voice level. She and Tate had been right about everything, including Freddie's innocence. "We're on the same side." He nodded, glancing at Tate. "Like I said, you probably could have started the conversation that way. You know, without kidnapping me." "Kidnapping him?" Her gaze snapped to Tate, but he didn't meet her eyes. "This again?" Freddie sniffed, grinned. "You sure know how to hold a grudge." "It's been 2 hours." Freddie laughed. The banter seemed to relax him a little. It did the opposite for her. What was Tate doing? Trying to play both sides? Stay in Leland's good graces while keeping one foot in her camp? Hedging his bets? She'd ask him to leave, but he seemed to have a calming effect on Freddie. Why bug my apartment? She wasn't sure Freddie had, but she wanted to throw him off. The levity on his face melted away. "That wasn't me." He looked at Tate. "I told you it wasn't me." "So tell her." "I don't know who did it for sure, but we were talking, mean Tate, and we think maybe it was Dawson and his crew. See, they're looking for me. They know I asked to see you before, so maybe they thought I might find you to tell you all this stuff I was going to tell you last year." Misty was having a hard time following. "Why would they bug my apartment?" "We think," Tate said. "Maybe they were hoping if you talked to Freddie, you might say where he was, or perhaps where you planned to meet him." Yeah, Freddie nodded. "That makes sense. They wanted to know where I was. Trying to shut me up. Figured they could follow you to get to me?" Summer asked. "So you don't think Misty is in danger from these people? Is that what you're saying? I mean, if she didn't care about any of this stuff, maybe. But she's been digging around, so—" His gaze returned to her. "Sorry, but I think you are now. It's not your fault. Not if everything he was saying was true. What about Jeffrey Kofer?" "That is my fault." He swallowed hard. I never thought they'd go after my lawyer. I don't know for sure, but I think they were trying to get him to tell where I was. Tate here told me he was beaten bad, like Phillips. The building inspector, Tate said for the benefit of everyone else in the room. Like they wanted people to think I did it, Freddie said. But I didn't. So maybe they were hoping to figure out where I was. But Kofor didn't know. I didn't tell nobody. Where have you been staying? Misty asked. Guy from prison had a place for me. I'm not gonna say where, though. Don't want none of this to blow back on him. And there might be blowback, 'cause I gotta bring these people down. Would you be willing to testify to all of this? He angled away. Testify? In what? Some trial? Like it's ever gonna get to trial? These people are powerful. They got money. They got influence. We gotta force the issue, or they're gonna wiggle out of it. Maybe Raoul and his crew go down for killing my sister in Kofor. I want to see that happen. But the guys pulling the strings, ain't no way they're going to jail unless we make it all public. So what do you propose? Misty asked. There's a thing tomorrow out at Hearts and Homes. They're dedicating the rec center, Misty said. I figured there'll be all sorts of powerful people there, maybe press and stuff. I thought I'd just... He shrugged, glanced at Tate. His plan is to interrupt the meeting and tell everybody what happened. Not just tell him. This is why I gotta have your help. We need proof, laid out all pretty and easy to understand. I'm not good with that kind of thing, but you guys can do it, right? Put together some papers and stuff we can hand out? Misty tried to understand his plan, if you could call it a plan. You want us to hijack the dedication and accuse the people there of murder, Freddie said. It's what they did, isn't it? To that refugee lady, Mr. Kofor, Layla. If the press see it, then the cops gotta deal with it. They can't just look the other way. Misty shifted her gaze to Tate. What do you think? I think there are better ways to handle it. Of course he did. Ways that made him and his boss come out looking squeaky clean. Not that he was wrong, at least about coming up with a better way. She laid her forearms on the table. Let's put the information together and present it to the Attorney General and the FBI. We can let them take it from there. He scowled, bringing to mind the terrifying ex-con she'd forgotten to fear. They won't do nothing. It's their job to... But they won't care. Why would they care about a couple dead women, a refugee and a single mom? Maybe they'd care about Kofor, but we got no way to pin that on 'em. No, I was gonna do it that way before, when I asked you to come see me, but they decided to play dirty. Now that I got my ma and niece out of town, I'm taking them down. Okay. Misty worked to keep her tone calm. But we can always go to the press later, if the authorities... Later, when I'm back in prison for crimes I didn't do? That's not going to happen, Misty said. You'll just have to tell... Tell who? Your boss? Humphrey? He's in on it, don't you see? Misty flicked her gaze to Tate, but he didn't seem alarmed by Freddie's accusation. Freddie's eyes flashed. Fear or fury, she wasn't sure. The DA's gonna prosecute me for Kofor's murder just to shut me up. All right. Misty tried to sound placating. I see what you're saying. She shifted her attention to Tate. It was possible she was wrong about him. What do you think? I think charging in and trying to hijack a fancy dinner is a bad idea. He gave Freddie an apologetic look. There might be some bad guys there, but most of the people will be supporters. Good people. We don't want to scare anybody. People gotta know the truth. They gotta know who they're giving money to. I agree, Tate said. I think we need to work together to come up with a plan. Maybe a two-pronged approach. We alert the authorities. He nodded to Misty, agreeing to her point. And send the press all the same information, simultaneously. Not a bad idea. But would Tate whitewash Leland's involvement? She was about to ask him point blank when Freddie pushed back from the table. Yeah, okay, maybe. I gotta think about it. He started to walk away, but Hughes shifted to stand in front of the door. Freddie turned to face her. Can I go to the bathroom? She smiled at him. Of course. And then we'll come up with a plan together.